Hello coders and welcome to the third part in this JavaScript course. What we're doing is building a bill calculator, a tip calculator if you will. We're using JavaScript, HTML and CSS. In the first tutorial I demonstrated the HTML markup, and in this tutorial we're going to style this markup and we're going to make this look like this. As you can see, there's quite a lot of styles that we need to apply in order to get our calculator to look like the final result. We're going to be dealing today with things like box shadows. We're going to be dealing with borders. We're going to be dealing with hovers and form inputs too. So let's get into the code and start styling this up. As I mentioned, all of this code is available. It's in the link in the show notes below. And when you get the code, it will be in this zip folder. And when you unzip that folder, you'll see all the bits and pieces, including the src folder. In the src folder, there is a styles.css file. This file contains all of the styles to style up this application. What we're going to do in this tutorial is we're going to reconstruct this in a new style sheet. And I'm going to be talking through each and every one of these selectors as well as their actual values to show you and demonstrate how to actually style this application. So let's just close down index for now. I'm going to create a new folder in the top level, and this folder is going to be src because of course we want to mimic what's in the dist folder. Okay, let's press enter on that. I'm going to create a new file. This is a style sheet file, and this is going to be called style.css. So now we have the style sheet that's in the dist folder, and we also have the style sheet that we're going to create. So what I'm going to do is run this vertically so I can see them side by side. So this is the original, this is our one that we're creating today. And the first thing we need to do is open up the index.html file. That's the one we were playing with last tutorial. And what we need to do is include the new style sheet into this. And we link an external style sheet like so. Type in link and then rel, give the value of style sheet and also a href. This href is going to be the location of this style sheet. So this is src/style.css. If we hit save and then just refresh the page, you'll see that nothing has actually changed. So let's go ahead and do that first of all. So now we've created a HTTP request to request that style sheet. Obviously that style sheet is empty. We're going to fill that out, but this is now included. What I'm going to do to make this a little bit easier is I'm going to drag this like so, and we're going to remove the structure and we're going to reduce the size of my IDE. This way we can see the styles, we can see the original style sheet here, and we can actually see the application too. The first thing I'm going to do is discuss the body element. So if we go into the HTML, we can see that we have the body element here. Everything within this body element is going to adhere to these styles, the styles that we put in the body selector. So this includes a font family, this includes a font size, and it also deals with the margin at the top. So let's go and add that in. Let's type body and then open that up. Type font family, and this is going to allow you to define the font family used in this application. So we're going to choose Arial, and we're also going to apply a serif as well. The next thing we're going to do is add the font size. So this is changing the size of the fonts within the body element. So let's choose font and then hyphen size. The size that we're going to use is 16 pixels. Okay, before I go any further, let's just refresh the page and see what we've done. Notice that the font size and the font family has changed. This is now in Arial, and the font size has been increased to 16 pixels. The next thing we want to do is supply a margin top to the body. This is because if we go into the original application, you can see that there is a space between the top and the first container. So let's go back into here and apply the margin top. And this is 100 pixels. Refresh the page and you should see this go down like so. So there's 100 pixels between the header and here. The headers do have their own styles, and we will be dealing with those in today's tutorial. But first of all, let's focus on the container class. If we go into the index.html file here, you'll see that we have a container. So this is a class with the selector of container like so. This is a div, and this wraps the whole application. So this is the first element within the body. We have a margin of 0 and auto. I'll explain what that is in just a second. And of course, a width of 500 pixels. Let's add that. So dot container. And this selector starts with a dot because, of course, this is a class, whereas the IDs, which are down here, they have hashes. So a hash is an ID, and then a dot is a class. So let's fill this out. The first thing we're going to do is apply a margin. Now, this is shorthand. Where we have 0, this is giving 0 top and bottom. And auto here is left and right. So when we don't apply shorthand, this would be 4 values across. So this would be 0, auto, 0, auto. But because the last 2 values are the same as the first 2 values, all we need to do is supply 2 values and they're copied across to their subsequent values. So let's save that. After the margin, we need to supply the width of 500 pixels. What we're going to do now is refresh this page, and you'll see a little small tweak to the display of this. So if we refresh now, did you see that the margin changed on the left-hand side? It's a bit difficult to see here because the screen is so small, but if I was to drag this out, you'll see that the margin on the left and the margin on the right is the same. And this is 500 pixels long. If we didn't supply the width, then the margin auto wouldn't know how big the div container should be, so it wouldn't know what the margins are on the left and the right. So let me just quickly demonstrate that. Let's go back to the code and let's just comment out this width. I'm going to save the work, go back to the browser and refresh the page. So now the application has jumped back to the left-hand side. This is because even though we've supplied the margin left and right as auto, we don't know how big in terms of width this div container is going to be. And so the browser cannot automatically calculate the margins on the left or the right without having the width of this container defined. So let's go and add that back. I'm going to uncomment the width. We're going to save it once more. Let's go back into the browser and refresh the page. I'm going to drag this back just to give me a little bit more room to play with. And as you can see, the margin on the left and the margin on the right has changed. This is 500 pixels wide. That's why it looks like there's less margin on the left than it is on the right. That's because 500 pixels contains more than just what we can see. As I've demonstrated in the first tutorial in the index HTML, we have 2 containers within this subcontainer. We've got the bill calculator, and if I scroll down here, we have the result container. So both of these sections are within their own containers, and we can control those through CSS. So let's just bring that back up. We're going to work on the bill calculator first. Now, this is an ID. So let's put in a hash and then bill calculator. The first thing I'm going to do is apply the background color. So let's type background and then hyphen color. We're going to choose a light blue for this. And what I'm going to do is just save this and refresh the page. So look, we are now dealing with the bill calculator. And this is what I meant by the width being 500 pixels long, even though the contents is less than 500 pixels, the container is, and therefore this margin here and this margin there is exactly the same. And if I was to drag this out once more just to show you, then the margins on the left and right are automatically spaced. The next thing we're going to do is give a padding of 20 pixels. Now, the difference between padding and margin is that margin goes on the outside of the container, whereas the padding goes on the inside of the container. So if I was to save this and refresh, you'll see that we have 20 pixels now between the top and the sides. However, it looks a bit weird because the bill calculator itself is in a header, and the header has its own default styles. So we have 20 pixels for the bill calculator padding, and then we've got some pixels specifically set to the header of the bill calculator itself. Now, these will be changed when we get to the header section. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is apply a margin bottom. So this is going to push out this container from this one. So underneath the background color, let's type margin hyphen and then bottom and then 40 pixels. Press save, refresh this, and you can see that this has just been pushed down by 40 pixels. After that, I'm going to apply a border. The next thing I'm going to do is give this a border, and we're going to use shorthand for this. So let's type border, and then let's give the border width of 1 pixel. We're going to give the border style of solid, and we're going to choose the color of dim gray. Okay, let's save this and refresh the page. So we now have a border around this bill calculator. The next thing I'm going to do is create a shadow behind this container. So we're going to use the box shadow, and we're going to do this in shorthand. So let's just create a new line underneath the light blue background, and we're going to supply box hyphen shadow, and we're going to give 10 pixels, 10 pixels, and 5 pixels. The color of this is going to be dark gray. Save your work, refresh the page. This is slowly coming on. It's starting to look a little bit more like the original, which is this one here. We now have the shadow behind. The next thing I'm going to do is focus on the container for the results. So let's scroll down here. This is again an ID. So let's type in result container. And we're going to apply the background color first. This is a light yellow. Let's hit save and press refresh. So we can just about see a small change there, a little change in color from white to light yellow. Let's make this container stand out a little bit more. Let's give it a border. So type border again. Let's do shorthand, 1 pixel. And this time it's going to be dark red in terms of color. And we're going to give it a border style of dashed. Press save and then refresh. So this is a good example of the margin in the header. So we can see there is some space between the top of this container and the top of this header. This is because the header itself has some style rules, whereas on the left-hand side and on the bottom, there is no gap between the container and the internal elements. The next thing that we need around this results container is padding. So let's type padding and then 20px. Refresh, and we'll see that we now have the same padding on this container that we do on the container above. Okay, it's time to deal with these headers. So let's just go down here and make a little bit of room. Type H1 because we want to target both of these H1 elements. So this one here and this one there. We would like these to be in the center. So let's type text align center. We also want them to have a padding themselves of 10 pixels. And if we refresh the page, we should see that this has changed. But notice that there's still a margin on the top. And this gets changed using this margin attribute like so. Again, we're going to use shorthand. What we're going to do is type margin, and we're going to give the value of 0, 0, 20 pixels. Press save and then refresh the page. And we can see that we now have the right margins around the headers. Let me just explain this shorthand. So margin 0, 0, 20 pixels 0. This means that this is the top margin. This would be 0. We have a right margin. Again, that would be 0. And we have the bottom margin, which would be 20. And we also have the left margin, which would be 0. And the reason why the left and the right margins are 0 is because we've got text align center. After the headers, we're going to focus on the field containers. Now, these field containers contain both the label and their inputs. If we went back to the index.html, you'll be able to see these here. So we have the form, and then in the form, we have a field container, the label, the input, and then another field container with that label and that input. So let's go back to the style and start adding those. So let's type field container. Again, this is going to be a class. And in this field container, we need to define the display. And we're going to display by flex. We also want to justify the content of the flex items. And we're going to do this using the space between value. So let's type in justify content and then space between. And if I was to save and then refresh here, this demonstrates that the field containers that have the display of flex will justify their items with the space between. The next thing I'm going to do is specify the margin as well. So again, we're going to use shorthand. So we do margin and then 0, 0, 10 pixels. And then 0 again. It's very similar to this one here. So this is the top, this is the right, this is the bottom, and this is the left. So what we're saying is that for each one of these field containers, we would like to have 10 pixels for the bottom margin. So let's hit save and then refresh. After this, we're going to be playing around with the label. What we're going to do is type field-container and then label. We would like to give the label itself padding of 10 pixels. So let's refresh and we can see that we have now created 10 pixels around the labels. After the labels, we're going to deal with the input. So let's type field container and then input. For each one of these inputs, we want to change the color of the borders. So let's type border. And again, let's do this in shorthand. So this is 1 pixel solid, and we're going to use dark gray. Let's also give the inputs a padding of 10 pixels. This is going to increase the size of the input fields themselves. Hit save and refresh. After this, we're going to deal with the button container. Now, the button container is the container that goes around this button. So this is the container here. And this, of course, is the button element. So what we want to do is type button container, and this means that anything in this container will adhere to text align center. So if we refresh now, we should see that we've moved this button into the center of this application. We now want to target specifically this button, and we could either just use the button element, or if we wanted to get a little bit more ingrained, we would type button container and then button. We would like to give the button a padding of 10 pixels because that would then conform to the rest of the styles. So let's type 10px. I also would like to give this a background color of blue. Let's save and then refresh. So there we go. Now notice that we have some default styles on here. This is a default border. To get around that, what we need to do is type border none, press save and then refresh, and then say goodbye to that border. Let's change the color of this button to be white. So type color and then the value of white. Let's refresh. That's looking slightly better. The next thing I'm going to do is give this a border radius. So even though we've said border none, we can still give it a border radius. So border -radius. and we're going to apply 8 pixels around. This is going to curve the corners of the border for the button here. So let's refresh. A button by default also has its own font size, and we can change this if we wanted to by inheriting the parent font size. So in this case, it would be the font size defined in the body. So let's scroll down here and change that. Font size inherit. Save that and then refresh. Notice that there's no hover state on the button at all. However, I can still click it. It's still going to process this form. However, there's no hover state. And if I went back to the original here, we can see that there is a hover state on here. And there's also a cursor as well, which is the pointer. So let's go and take a look at those. Let's change the hover state of the button. So let's do button : hover, and we would like to give a background color of red. We don't need to supply the color of white because it's going to be the same color as it is by default, but we do need to supply a cursor of pointer. Save and then refresh once more and hover over that button. So now we can see that it changes color from blue to red, and also we have the cursor when we hover over it. Let's tidy up these disabled inputs. So let's scroll down here. What I would like to have is this to be white. If we went back to the original, we can see that these are white. So let's go back to this one. What I'm going to do is type inputs and then : disabled. So this is going to target all of the inputs that are marked as disabled. And for this, we're going to type background color and then press save and then refresh. And this should be exactly the same now as this one. You may have noticed that there were some additional styles in here that I didn't apply because there's no need. For instance, the color of the hover is white and the color of a default button is also white. There's no need for that. There's also other things to do with displays as well. I will go through and tidy up the code that you download to meet the new set of rules. So let's just bring this out so you can see what it looks like in its entirety. It looks exactly the same as the original. And of course, it functions just the same as it did in the previous tutorial. In the next and final tutorial in this course, I'm going to be demonstrating the JavaScript that processes and calculates the values that you supply to this bill calculator. This is going to calculate the total bill, it's going to calculate the total tip, and the total per person. So the next tutorial is going to be very JavaScript heavy. Please remember that all of this code is available to you in the link in the show notes below. And of course, if you've got a coding question, then do let our community know. Go to howtocodewell.net/Discord to join. And whilst you're there, check out the other courses at howtocodewell.net. Thank you ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everybody. And I'll see you again in the JavaScript tutorial. Cheers. Bye.